before they start the seminar, Mustafa will be doing a presentation. Turkish 2 minutes.
Turkish 2 minutes. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mustafa Işcan. I'm a Kiel University student, PhD student, working on Cold War. I've been following Bülent and Vasilis almost over 10 years, and they have produced 3 books. First one was on American project since the Second World War, where they developed the historical analysis on global economic crisis, and their contribution to the theory is to further develop the global fault lines, following the idea of Andre Günther Frank and Peter Gowan. The first book was the New American Imperialism after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the United States was the lone wolf as a superpower. They analyze and identify how the Soviet is using the power to exhaust the world resources and managing the global economy. They also explain this was backfiring, as far as I understand, and the U.S. economy was never immune from the crisis since 1970, when the competition worldwide forced the rate of profit down in United States and enforced the neoliberal policies all over the West. Of course, the capital flow from overseas, where they can increase the rate of profit, and ratio is increased when the capital moved to east part of the globe, China, India, and the capital stayed over there. And then second book came in 2012. It was the fall of U.S. empire, which was discussion on how the power shift from global west to global east, where China, India, and other emerging economies outperform the United States. And the last book is a contribution to the new era. It's titled as the disintegration of the Euro-Atlanticism and the new authoritarianism, discussion based on the finding in 2005 books and in 2012 books, 2 books, and they aim to explain the cause of the rising right-wing populism and racism, not only in Europe but all over the world. Also aim to convince the youth on the general public what's wrong with the European project, and introduce discussion materials to how to overcome the authoritarianism and austerity in Europe, not only in Europe, but all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa. This book is about, as Mustafa mentioned, it's about global politics and economics. And as such, it touches on many different aspects of current world politics. But here, we would like to concentrate, each of us, one aspect each. I'm going to concentrate on rising right-wing populism, and Vasilis is going to talk about mainly German ordo-liberalism. So I'm going to talk about 15, 20, 25 minutes, and then Vasilis will follow me. Antonio Gramsci, in his prison notebooks, wrote in 1930 the following: "The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." So this is what Gramsci wrote in 1930. Gramsci was preoccupied with the breakdown and collapse of the liberal order, which was in existence after the Second World War. After the First World War. When struggling to understand the rise of fascism, rise of power of Mussolini, Gramsci used the term morbid symptom or morbid phenomena. And he says, as I mentioned before, the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. in this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. For Gramsci, Mussolini, or Italian fascism, was one such morbid symptom. Interregnum, as referred by Gramsci there, can be understood as a period where one arrangement of hegemony is waning or disappearing, but prior to the emergence of another arrangement of hegemony. So one hegemonic system is declining or disappearing or getting weaker and weaker before the rise and the establishment of another system of hegemony. In our opinion, the world is once again living an interregnum. It is poised between inward-looking old powers, mainly United States and its allies, and reluctant emergent ones, like China, India, and a number of other emerging powers. And we argue that Brexit as well is one of the many morbid symptoms of our times. So is Trump, and similar developments such as razor fences, rising Eastern European borders, militant Hindu nationalism in Modi's India, Shinzo Abe's campaign for national revival in Japan, militaristic tactics of Duterte in the Philippines, Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, and many more, including the government in Italy and a number of other similar right-wing populist movements in almost all over the world. Probably, most likely, we will end up with another almost fascistic government in Brazil after this coming weekend. This right-wing authoritarian surge is not rooted in the personalities or psychology of Trump, Erdogan, or Matteo Salvini. Underneath the current conditions, bringing these right-wing populist authoritarian persons and the movements in power are long-term historical factors, factors affecting the changing power balance in the world, and factors related to changing economic and political dimensions of the global architecture of power. Trump, Erdogan, Matteo Salvini, or the forthcoming right-wing fascist leader of Brazil are less the creators. They didn't create these conditions. They are less the creators than the outcome of the protracted economic, social, and political processes. All such right-wing shifts are the results of an increasingly more volatile and chaotic international situation. This is the direct consequence of a process what Giovanni Arrighi called hegemonic transition within a period of systemic chaos. This long and protracted period of hegemonic transition from the Euro-Atlantic core to Asian economies, especially China and India, like every period of hegemonic transition and instability in the past, in which the old is dying and the new cannot be born yet, as Gramsci put it, creates morbid symptoms. In many parts of the world, including the United States and Europe, new forms of authoritarianism have emerged within the context of global crisis. Severe austerity measures, economic nationalism, racism, and xenophobia emerge and become dominant norms almost everywhere in the world. This new authoritarianism is a morbid phenomenon in itself, and it is at the root of other authoritarian and morbid symptoms that grow from below. This right-wing populist move in Britain is of course in line with the global patterns which we mentioned earlier, in particular in line with the dominant discourse in Europe that sees itself as a white Christian continent. This mythology of a white Europe or a historically white Britain was at the center of the Brexit debate. Through the Brexit debate, British politics have been transformed within just a matter of weeks. A rightward shift was characterized by the politics of race and nation. Overt racism has become normalized in a way not seen since the late 1970s. Not in the areas of industrial decline like the place where I live, Stockholm-Trent, but even in London, even in the South. that kind of racist right-wing culture emerged and almost normalized during and after the Brexit debate. This discourse provided a context for the brutal killing of Jo Cox, a Labour MP known for her support for Syrian refugees. When seen through the blood-stained frame of racialized politics, the European Union referendum was not felt like an exercise in democracy. When the authority of a major power or a superpower is on the wane, this affects the entire world order and leads to instability and chaos. The United States is facing a decline for the last 4 decades that has grown more noticeable since the end of the Cold War. Even though the United States, in terms of actual figures and statistics, still represents the largest and strongest economy and military power in the world, it is nevertheless struggling with severe weaknesses resulting from low economic growth and the protracted decline of its industry. The decline in productive capacity and the ever-widening gap between productive and financial accumulation lead to recurrent financial and economic crises in every corner of the world. The global chain of extreme financialization and speculative profiteering broke in 2007-8, only to be transplanted into the Eurozone via the over-leveraged banking sector. In parallel to this decline in the overall weight and influence of the United States, the last 2 decades, or 3 decades now, have witnessed the emergence of other economic powers, pushing themselves to the top position. The US-centered world of post-World War II is losing its predominance and being replaced by a new international system shaped by the arrival of these new actors. This is basically what causes the breakdown of global order and the turn of the ruling elite in many countries to unconstrained economic and political nationalism. The West collectively, noticeably, does not have the means to back up its policies in the Middle East, Africa, Ukraine, and Southeast Asia. The new emerging powers, on the other hand, aspire to a new order of global politics, but lacking any real leadership capacity yet. They are not yet in a position to impose their will upon various regional and global conflicts. Therefore, leadership, order, and regional and global governance are no longer assured. The world is currently in a fragile imbalance as the global hegemon's decline continues. Described fittingly by Financial Times journalist Martin Wolf, I quote, "US power has retreated both geopolitically and economically, and we are living once again in an era of strident nationalism and xenophobia." This is exactly what Gramsci or Giovanni Arrighi later described as a period of interregnum. As mentioned before, hegemonic powers come and then eventually go. But the process of rise and decline of a global power is a lengthy affair, producing a number of morbid phenomena in between. History does not repeat itself so neatly. Fascism of the interwar period is dead, but the emergence of right-wing populists and fascistic parties with extreme fascistic programs is a reality. It is difficult to see how this is contained within individual countries. Italy, for instance, seems once again one of the first to try it out. Under these conditions of increasing strength of far right, the methods of assassination and disappearances as a means of dealing with opponents are becoming ever more prevalent. The recent tragic fate of Cemal Khashoggi in Saudi embassy in Istanbul must be taken as a serious warning. Apparently, even his high-level connections with the Turkish leadership and the American leadership failed to protect him. The only answer to all these threats, and in particular a global decline into fascism and world war, is the building of a mass revolutionary movement, uniting international working class in the fight against inequality, dictatorship, fascism and war. Thank you.
I was preparing a different type of talk before I met Bülent over a cup of coffee, and I had to change completely. But even that preparation I made was very rough. The reason being, my teaching load has increased massively in the university, and I wasn't even able to sit down and write a couple of kind of structure, PowerPoint presentation. My friend, where is he prepared the PowerPoint? We don't have PowerPoint presentation. So, and Bülent asked me to say, why don't you focus on something you mostly developed in the book, the German social market economy, or ordoliberalism, or the Freiburg school as they call it, because that type of public policy, which is now acting as a major cohesive, quote-unquote, force in the Eurozone, is the one that tries to keep the Eurozone together and avoid the further unraveling of the transatlantic bloc. What we're saying here, effectively in the book, is that the global system is composed of inter-imperialist contradictions, similar to the type of the era of Lenin, but not only inter-imperialist contradictions. The inter-imperialist contradictions concern China, Russia on the one hand, which are states that are not controlled by the United States, and the intra-imperialist contradictions, which unraveled especially with the 2007-2008 crisis, is the transatlantic bloc, including Japan and Australia. The importance of having this distinction, which partly comes from Peter Gowan and partly, believe it or not, from Bukharin's work on imperialism, which is under-examined, especially in this country and elsewhere. Bukharin's work on imperialism is superior, in my view, to that of Lenin, because he talks about geopolitical blocks. In the intra-imperialist contradictions, a competing geopolitical bloc is difficult to be formed. I cannot imagine you and me, and those in this room, for example, thinking of Germany and France uniting and going to war against the United States. But it is possible, and China is forming a geopolitical bloc in Southeast Asia by its asset buying, infrastructure buying across South Asia, in Africa and elsewhere. It is a geopolitical competitor to the United States, possibly, not least because the polity of China is not controlled by the United States, whereas German polity, the French polity, through the hub and spoke mechanism the United States created after the Second World War, is completely subordinate to the United States, although economically there is some relative independence, obviously, between Europe and the United States. Look at the tariff wars and the independent kind of, as a European Union, as a trade bloc and so on and so forth. But it's not a geopolitical competitor to the United States. So it's very important to have that distinction in mind. And that's how we divided the world in our first chapter, Global Politics and Economics Today, with the help of Peter Gowan, late Peter Gowan, and Nikolai Bukharin. Now, ordoliberalism is the current public policy that manages the crisis of the Eurozone, right? It is not new at all. It is a form of neoliberalism that developed well before the Chicago Boys of Milton Friedman. In fact, Friedman joined the ordoliberals in the Mont Pelerin Society in the 40s. That was led by Hayek. Mm. So the Anglo-Saxon neoliberal project, it's a consequence and the side effect of the Austro-German political and economic and sociological and legal thinking, because ordoliberalism is a comprehensive interdisciplinary system of thought. It had constitutional historians, constitutional lawyers, philosophers, sociologists, you name it. Comprehensive system of law. They had differences. I mean, there is no, me and Bülent sometimes when we discuss, we have differences, but we write a book together, it doesn't mean anything. They had differences, sometimes the Austrians were more different views by the rest of the German colleagues that were in Freiburg and so on and so forth. The names, when I start dealing with, reading with these names, I've never heard before, and I'm sure you've never heard before. Somebody called Eucken, Müller-Armack. Müller-Armack, maybe you have heard if you're a good historian, because Müller-Armack, who was a member of the Nazi Party in Germany in the interwar period, was the guy who negotiated on behalf of Germany the Treaty of Rome, believe it or not. Yeah? So you see the connection here between the ordoliberal thinking, on the one hand, yeah, and the innate authoritarianism in the thinking of all ordoliberals that they tried, and here there are history books here by great historians that they prove the connection between ordoliberalism and the authoritarian core of ordoliberalism, how they implanted it in the treaties of the European Union. And we think that the European Union is a great democratic space that everybody wants to join, including Turkey. I don't know if Turkey dropped that official policy yet. I don't know. I don't think it did, right? There, joining the European Union. Everybody wants to be a member of that democratic club. Yeah, now, perhaps less after the crisis, correct, but still they're aspiring to join. It's not that rosy. The story is far more complicated and you know, leans towards authoritarianism in many respects, and we'll see why. How did the ordoliberals start? They call them ordoliberals because they used to publish a journal called Ordo, which means order in Germany. I think you attended the workshop I have on ordoliberalism at UEL. You attended the workshop on ordoliberalism at UEL I had. I thought you were there last year, 12th of December.
Yeah, probably.
You did. And you asked a good question as well. I said, social market economy was not authoritarian at all. I'll come to that.
Yeah.
Do you remember you?
Yeah, in the middle of...
Yeah. You were very good. Yeah. Because you had the German experience as a worker there. I understand perfectly. They started... We had the financial crisis at the 20s, and already there was discussion of ordoliberals as neoliberals because they wanted to advance classical liberalism of the 19th century. Yeah? They did not want to abandon the principle of free market, but how are they going to do it with the collapse of the gold standard? And the collapse of the, as Boulen said, the collapse of the British Empire when there was an interregnum period. How are they going to do it? Fascism was rising, they said they were liberal, this kind of, they offer an alternative model, kind of mixed economy, authoritarian. That's why many old liberals joined the Nazi party, like Müller-Armack. And then they had Carl Schmitt in front of them to confront the Nazi constitutional theorist. Major contribution to political science by Schmitt we had in the 20s and 30s, political theology, the politics, theory of politics, political enemy and friend, binary. These are amazing, I think. What was the key element in Schmitt's theory? Schmitt's key element was the state of exception. And that's what neoliberals liked a lot. Hayek liked that very much, although he doesn't say because he's a Nazi theorist, but Hayek was deeply authoritarian. Deeply authoritarian. That's why when in Chile Pinochet got in, he sent him a letter, said under certain conditions when capitalist economy is in crisis, we can have a strong leader, a fascist, a Nazi, authoritarian leader to create, to secure and to reinstitute the free market order. That's Hayek. So because the state in the ordoliberal thinking, as relatively opposed to the neoliberal thinking, is the one that enhances and institutes market freedom. It is the state that does the job, not the free, spontaneous forces of the market. The ordoliberals liked that very much, but many of them did not identify with the fascist party. In fact, some of them, Hitler persecuted them, and one of them, Eucken, went to Istanbul to find such an exile place of exile, went to Istanbul and worked in Istanbul. Eucken, I think he was, or Rasto, I don't remember, I need to check. It's very complicated intellectual history, I must tell you. They published it. Then they found sponsors after the Second War period. So what was the requirement? The requirement was to have a comprehensive system of thought, yeah, a policy system, practical, that is beyond classical liberalism, beyond fascism and Nazism models, beyond Bolshevism, and beyond Keynesianism. Beyond Keynes. They didn't like Keynes at all. No. Fiscal deficit, deficit spending. No. The budget must be disciplinarian. This all comes from German thinking. It doesn't come from American or Anglo-Saxon thinking. They are far more lax systems of thought. German is about discipline, okay? Disciplinarian system of thought. So the key principles for Liberalism, as they come to the fore in the secret society of Mont Pelerin in Switzerland, that was financed by many entrepreneurs at the time. I forgot their names. It's all on the record. We have now the archival work has been done on the Mont Pelerin Society from 1948 to still. They have a website. If you Google, there is still a website, Mont Pelerin Society. They have a president, they have a structure, but now it's gone. Friedman joined in the late 40s. Friedman also became president when Hayek withdrew, and there were conflicts there and so on. But they all had, under the hegemony of Germany, a common understanding and a common view on how politics and economics should be connected. The major principle of ordoliberalism, which distinguishes even today, I would say, to a certain degree, Germany, the German model from the Anglo-Saxon models, is the strict independence of the central bank. No political interference at all. So the system of central bank governance, yeah, must be completely depoliticized. So if Merkel or a German politician, Adenauer, was to go to, Adenauer was himself very ordoliberal, very ordoliberal. All German chancellors were very ordoliberal. Merkel, in her speech, praised the whole ordoliberal thing of Germany. Why? Because they accepted the principle that if the trade union want high wages, and if the central bank says no high wages, I want to raise interest rates because I want to beat inflation, no, and they present their forecasting models and the quantitative data they have with the models and this, or no. This is completely technocratic affair, has nothing to do with politics and class struggle. I'm not negotiating. And you know what? This is what Schäuble said to Varoufakis. Varoufakis was saying fantastic neo-Keynesian stuff. He said, I will take austerity. Well, that's what Varoufakis was saying. I reviewed his book, Adults in the Room. Varoufakis employed people from the IMF. Jeffrey Sachs, the guy who drafted the program of neoliberal shock therapy, remember Peter Gower, he was on his team. He thought with this team of neoliberals, we're going to convince the Germans to cancel 60% of the debt and make it viable to pay back the rest of the 40% with austerity. Varoufakis was taking harsh austerity. Schäuble was saying, no, this is what we've agreed with the previous government. This is the central banking criteria. We're not going to cancel any debt. Who's going to pay the debt? The German taxpayer? We don't have a state behind the European Union. We only have European Central Bank. The European Central Bank is not a federal bank, it's not the American Fed. There's no state, there's no fiscal entity. The only federal entity that exists in the European Union, in fact today, in the Eurozone, is only one. And you know what that is? It's the euro. The euro is a federal currency without a federal state. That is it. So therefore it is, and that euro mechanism, yeah, defines the anti-inflationist policy across, deflationist policy across the Eurozone. So no one can come in with a Keynesian, even slightly pro-Keynesian approach in the Eurozone. If you don't like it, you're out. They said, you don't like this? Out. Not discussing anything. Schäuble, after all, is not an economist. I think he's a lawyer. Varoufakis is a great economist. Whatever you can say, I don't like him. He's a narcissist. He whatever. He's a good economist, he's a very good economist. He's brilliant. It didn't convince anybody, because these are the technocratic rules. You have to do 1, 2, 3, 4 according to the European Central Bank, which is founded according to the Deutsche Bank criteria, the German Central Bank. There is a fantastic book which I've read from cover to cover. It's quite thick, 900 pages. Very few people quote it, very few, they don't mention it. It hasn't been written by Marxists. You know, it has been written by Ken Dyson, who is in Cardiff University, I think, and Kevin Featherstone, who is the director of the European Institute at the LSE. The Road to Maastricht. Highly recommended. Highly recommended. The Road to Maastricht. What does he say? Secret negotiations between France and Germany started since 1963 under de Gaulle. De Gaulle wanted to have a Germany that will never again threaten France militarily. Yeah? German economy was booming under the social market economy. The social market economy was a compromise that Germany accepted at the time under pressure by Keynesian policy making, which prevailed in Europe. That's why they call it social market economy. In fact, it was a camouflaged ordoliberalism with many social elements, but that was social market economy. The term the term as such is inserted in the European treaties. Read the Amsterdam Treaty of 1997, it's there. Yeah, it's there. And when recently I read a commercial, actually, an advertisement in The Economist written by the Chinese Deputy Minister of Economy of China, he says there that they are accusing us that how can we combine communism with free market. But we in China have something very close to what you have in Germany and Europe, and we call it social market economy in Chinese. Can you believe that? I have that, I forgot to forward it to you. I was reading and said, yeah, we have very mixed system. Chinese enterprises are mixed with private, and we have partnerships, and we do common ownership and all that beautiful stuff that in Germany do. Small and medium-sized enterprises are united with the banks, they're sponsored by banks, and they do business together. We have the social model. Why are you accusing us that we are free marketeers in China? We're not free marketeers in China. You know, we have, like you in Europe. It's in economies, you know, the advancement. Probably the Chinese paid millions of pounds to have this in a prominent position, you know. So here we have in that book by Featherstone and Dyson a detailed description of the secret negotiations between France and Germany. Nobody else was there. So much for democracy and transparency in the European Union. Under the auspices of de Gaulle, how to create a common currency. The idea of common currency was thrown on the table by de Gaulle first. The Germans did not want a common currency. They don't want to relinquish their Deutsche Mark. They had their central bank, powerful, stable currency. It was the French franc that was boom, 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 going up and down, and the French were losing face. But Germany is coming up again. How are we going to anchor her around France? And the Germans insisted throughout their negotiations, if they want a euro, a common currency, ECU you were calling it at the time, economic currency unit, if you European currency, if you want a common currency, it has to be based on a bank, on a European central bank that will be modeled after the German central bank. Complete independence from any political interference. Who is Varoufakis that comes to give talk to Draghi and to Schäuble? Who is he? Greece? Pathetic. I mean, what is the population? What is the leverage? Well, nothing. Well, you want to go out, leave. Don't give us talk. We have an independent central bank. No political interference. These are what our technocrats say. These are what the numbers say. Numbers. So there is no alternative. The TINA thing, there is no alternative, which we think is an Anglo-Saxon invention. No, it's not Anglo-Saxon, German invention. Yeah, it's a German. The discipline comes from that particular part of the world, the Austro-German economics. So they won the negotiations. The last redoubt, so to say, it was the Mitterrand's experiment. in 1983, when Mitterrand came to power, a program to nationalize, to inflate the economy. Yeah? And this is all comes from that book. This is all archival work. It came to inflate the economy, could not cope with the power of the German Deutschmark. So at some point had either to get out of the exchange rate mechanism that was building up to the European Union, the European Economic Area, monetary area, either to get out of the exchange rate mechanism and then declare complete independence of France. But would not be able. All the business people there were saying, don't do that, we're going to collapse as an economy. Had to all to devalue within it. But devaluing meant defeat against the German economy and the powerful Deutschmark. So what did he do? He sent this Cardestan secretly, who was negotiating since the 60s and knew the German diplomats, and said, tell the Germans to overvalue their mark a bit, so we have the face to say we devalue because the German mark overvalued. Can you believe that? So German call overvalued a bit, so for the French to save face. And then of course the Keynesian experiment collapsed, as you know, it had the famous U-turn, 1983. So Germany won, dominated over France, and the last thing that now they are resisting a little bit is the control of the French budget through the European semester mechanism, which we describe in the book in detail. European semester mechanism is it's part of the Stability and Growth Pact. It's an outgrowth of the Stability and Growth Pact, which effectively says it was built as part of the ordoliberal public policy making after the crisis of the Eurozone in order to control the budgets of the European Union states. And in other words, you have in every European state, including Italy, of course Greece and Spain and everywhere, before the budget goes to Parliament, it has to be approved by the local reps, the representatives of the Commission. Yeah? If the Commission doesn't approve the budget, which is an austerity budget, it doesn't go to Parliament. That's democracy. So the states of the European Union are co-federated around the needs of the euro as an anti-inflationary currency. And the anti-inflation currency, it should be in an anti-inflationary zone in order for Europe as a whole to be competitive with other economies, especially the Chinese penetration of the European market and in global trade. So the new authoritarianism of the European Union, which is around the policy, the ordoliberal policy of Germany, is partly the result of the global financial crisis, the Eurozone crisis, as a management crisis policy, and under pressure by the Chinese penetration, the Chinese capital penetration of parts of the world that there are European interests, including Europe itself. China has a strategy of war. It's called One Belt, One Road strategy. It's buying assets everywhere in South Asia. Gwadar is almost Chinese. There is a big debate in Pakistan whether this is good or a new Chinese imperialism, but this is also foreign direct investment. Africa goes up. We have our findings in the book indicate that they buy German assets constantly. There is a Chinese-dominated Asian Development Bank, which Germany also joined, and so on. Not even Britain joined the Asian Development Bank, so dominated by China. And now they start blocking acquisition of assets by China. In Australia happened, in Germany happened, in the United States happened. So Chinese penetration of capital is all over the place. The resistance that the Eurozone provides in a way, by way of kind of resisting Chinese aggression, capitalist aggression, and by way of resisting its own collapse and total disintegration, is this. Without this ordoliberal authoritarian system of austerity, European Union wouldn't be able to survive. Because the management of the crisis of the Eurozone, which is still ongoing, is entirely based on ordoliberal public policy. Discipline, austerity, anti-inflation bias, export-led growth. Germany requires from every state of Europe to become export-led. Low wages, low inflation, export-led. And this reminds us all the Keynesian, how Keynes called it, the paradox of drift, or the fallacy of composition. You cannot have every member of the Eurozone being an export country. Somebody will have more export and will be richer, and somebody will have fewer export. Well, what export has Greece? Yogurt, feta cheese? How is he going to make a surplus out of this export? Germany makes a surplus because Greece imports BMWs and Mercedes. And Greece issues debt in euros, in order to have some liquidity for the Greeks to buy the German and Mercedes. So here is the balance of payments problem. So therefore somebody is rich in order for somebody to be poor. You cannot have a Eurozone everybody rich. I will stop here, and if there are any other issues that I forgot, I left out. As I said, I don't have a structured presentation, but I hope we can all discuss and give me the opportunity to answer things that I haven't managed to include in my, on top of my head presentation. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, contributions with questions.
Oh, great.
Yeah, it's great.
Okay. It was very nice to listen to you, because we are missing quite a lot of information on what happens in the economic level in the European Union and so on. My question is this. Okay, what are your scenarios? Where will it go? What do you think will it happen? It could be one scenario or several scenarios. What are your perspectives?
Where are we going to?
Yeah.
And the answer depends on the time scale. And probably it is easier to speculate in a longer time scale. For instance, I can talk about probably more realistically what the global system of politics and economics will look like by 2050. But I would find it much more difficult to talk about the next 10 years. Because from here up to 2050, it's a ups and downs and really troubled period. But I know where it is moving to, where it is going to. I can also talk about what the world will look like by the end of this century. So the direction is to me more clear than the actual steps. And especially short-term steps is much more difficult to predict or even to speculate. I think by 2050, there will be a global system more settled than it is now, controlled by China, India, to some extent United States, but I can't imagine the European Union as a unified economic and political force in that global table by that time. And it will be a multipolar world, but multipolar world more and more controlled, influenced, and directed by the new powers rather than the old declining United States, which will still be there because of the size, because of the strength of the US economy and politics and military. US will still be there even by mid-century, but in a gradually declining way. And therefore they have to negotiate almost for everything with the new global powers, especially China, India, and probably Russia and Brazil. So these powers will be there, definitely. It doesn't matter what kind of mess they are in right now, because from here up to there, it's a kind of a long process. But eventually, sooner or later, they will be there. Vasilis?
Me and Bülent are trained as historians, and if you ask historian who will tell you cannot predict the future at all, maybe we can diagnose some tendencies or structural tendencies, as Bülent said. The structural tendency is the formation of geopolitical blocs, one around China and perhaps Russia, which of course the United States will try to divide and rule, and the other geopolitical bloc would be United States, Britain, and Europe, because Europe is completely subordinated militarily to the United States. This is how I see the future. It will not be less conflict, but will be more conflict. Who said that the Pope said that we are in the Third World War, but it's not happening the way it used to happen. It happens in Syria, where there are wars by proxy, Russia is involved. Another obvious sign of decline of the United States, of course, is that they don't dare to do anything in Syria, or they don't dare yet. I mean, I don't know if they're going to do anything in Syria.
Or in Ukraine.
Or in Ukraine, for that matter, or in the Crimea. I mean, the Russians did the referendum overnight. They said Crimea is Russian. I mean, that was it. So that is a brief description of where we're heading to. The Eurozone may not exist in a few years' time. We don't know how Italy will behave. I really don't know. But without this discipline and austerity, the Eurozone cannot exist. It cannot exist. I mean, even if Greece had opted out, if Greece had gone out, especially when the debt was held by private investors, 84% debt was held by private investors in 2009, 2010. If at that moment Greece had threatened to leave, if Papandreou, the boy, the young, as prime minister, who threatened to go for a referendum, he announced it actually, and then Sarkozy and Merkel, you know, like his bosses, they asked him to go to Paris, and he immediately said, no, I'm not going to have a referendum, and came back. Ridiculous. I believe his father would not have backed down, you know, the old Andreas, and would have gone for a referendum, the Greeks would have voted against, and now would have been out. And then banks, German banks, and French banks would have been screwed, because one of the things that nobody talks about, that the French and the German banks were the first banks that failed in the Eurozone, were not Greek banks or Italian banks, because those banks had bought massive junk paper, the CDOs and CDS from Anglo-American banks. And Merkel goes to the central bankers and said to the parliament, says, I need 450 billion euros. If I don't find them, my economy will go bust. Big economies collapse. Solid economies collapse. Big industrial countries collapse. This country had blackouts in the 70s. No electricity. Greece did have electricity in the 70s, you know. You know, not too many television sets, but electricity, nobody suffered electricity. These big countries collapse, any time can collapse. So what did they do? They displaced the crisis to the periphery. They asked the speculators, and then how they call them, the spreads went mad. They speculated on the Greek public debt. And they displaced, and they gave them the memorandum of understanding, the bailout, and the bailout passed this this private debt onto the taxpayers, onto public balance sheets. That's what they did. And the Greek governments that signed this should be all go to prison, because that was the greatest betrayal ever made to the Greek people. To have private investors that from all over the world were buying debt, Greek bonds, and suddenly ask the Greeks to pay for that. That's what happened. That's what happened now as we speak. And Syriza signed to that third memorandum. Don't give me anything that is left. There's no left.
I think what Vasilis mentioned about displacing the crisis to the periphery is probably one of the most important aspects of what is happening now. And I remember after 2008 crisis, I think the following year, 2009, a group of economists in France, they were analyzing the impact of the global financial crisis in Eurozone. And they, in order to show this, to illustrate this on maps, they drew a map of Europe and surrounding area, and they colored some countries red. But all those countries red, which was, I think Greeks partly was red, but the actual complete red countries was from Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria, I think Jordan was red as well. And they said these are the Europe's near abroad. These countries require Eurozone support, but with the crisis, when the crisis hits Europe, and Europe pushes the crisis to the periphery, and probably before anywhere else, these countries collapse. And we'll have geopolitical upheavals like civil wars. And in 2 years after this, we ended up with so-called Arab Spring. So I think political economists can see these kind of things. And when they publish this, probably most of the people completely ignore this map. So only after 2011 we found it, and then we said, oh yes, those people were right. Yes.
I have to tell you, I don't find this particularly useful as a trade union activist in the UK. And I'm not even sure that I share your critique of how neoliberalism re-established itself after the Second World War. I was in Vienna just a couple of weeks ago, and you asked the Viennese, well, you know, the Soviet Union occupied, you know, marched into Vienna. They held Vienna, and for some reason, and the basis of the Nazi regime was actually racism. You know, the purity, the master race, the ultimate of fascism. Well, America, but that was at that time still an officially racist state. But what did the Austrians do? They allowed the Americans to have dominance over Vienna, over Austria, rather than say we need, you know, whatever you can say about Stalin, he was not a racist, he was a tyrant. But he wasn't a racist, he wasn't a fascist. And without reference to those facts, I don't find that the critique of economics is, if it doesn't start from those sorts of considerations, any analysis of what banks get up to, it doesn't help right now. And I think, you know, the whole point about Marxist critique of capital, you know, Adam Smith, it was Adam Smith that said the hidden hand of the market forces. It was Anglo-Saxon. And he said that won't work because the material forces of nature, of which humankind is the only conscious part, in other words, or rather, the rational part, only the human species can see the end of life on Earth. Only the human species can organize itself to make sure that it doesn't get wiped out beforehand. That's the nature of human consciousness, different from any other consciousness. Now, I don't know whether elephants and monkeys know that they're going to die. I think they do know that. They see all their parents die, and they try to stop their children from dying. Just like we do. And up until, you know, a couple hundred years ago, we thought that was it. But the whole notion of enlightenment was that all the forces that determine our future, our happiness, our well-being, are just the same as the forces that determine the health and well-being and future of all the other species. But the difference that makes us our superior intelligence is not for our benefit. Well, a big part it's for our benefit, insofar as we can use it to enjoy life until its natural end. And if we don't use it knowing that it will end by making sure that the conditions that we need to be around for us to exist until then, in other words, the planned cultivation of the means of sustainable means of our existence, that was the whole nature of what the Marxist project was about. I mean, it wasn't kicked off by Marx. I mean, he developed it. It arose from the disintegration of the royal, the Holy Roman Empire. You know, when you had, Christian principalities, kingdoms, city-states, republics, all fighting each other. It was dog eat dog, who's going to win at the expense of the others. Now that, you referred that to the Christian roots of capitalism. Dog eat dog liberalism. Dog eat dog at that stage, Christianity. And it was Kant, a Christian scientist, who, according to some, wrongly, barely walked out of Königsberg, but where that was, that was the border between the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire just down the road, and the British Empire across the Channel. So, and he said that unless you overcome the Christian misunderstanding of our evolution, unless you repudiate the fact that humankind was different from other species, and until we overcome that, there will be self-serving wars between hegemonies. Now that was Stalin, I'm afraid, didn't grip that. The Second International, supported the brutality, the military rape of Africa.
Can I just briefly respond to you, and then we will ask you? I think this is really, it is good that we look at history for some answers. But as a historian, as I mentioned, history never repeats itself. But especially when you start saying that you don't agree with our history of neoliberalism, probably you misunderstood what we meant by neoliberalism. So basically what we described in this book or in other books, we took from Marxist historians. One of them is Peter Gowan. Neoliberalism is according to Marx's definition, is a set of restructuring measures which emerged in the 1970s. And
that need to be repudiated.
Yes, in the Western world, but there is a reason why neoliberalism emerged. To us, in our books, what makes us, maybe our writing is different than many other books about neoliberalism. Many people talk about neoliberalism as an evil ideology and cause all those gap between poor and rich and the military coups in Latin America, everywhere. That's all fine. But many of them don't explain why and how neoliberalism emerged. It wasn't because just one morning Milton Friedman woke up and said, oh, I just taught a new ideology, let's put this. It didn't emerge like this. The key thing to understand neoliberalism is to understand a very basic Marxist term, rate of profit. I mean,
I'm so
in
sorry.
The volume
it's the use of violence. It's the use of violence.
Can I finish and then?
But I don't accept the premise.
No,
and this isn't even Marx.
But it is not even a premise. It is a written explanation by almost all existing, living or recently dead Marxist theorists. So neoliberalism, the term was even given. The term didn't exist before 1970s. So when so in order to understand this, you need to understand rate of profit. Rate of profit, Marx explains in in Capital Volume 2. I mean, if you are not, say again?
3.
Yes, so sorry, in Capital Volume 3, there's a chapter on rate of profit. So if you don't agree with this, then why are you talking about Marxism? This is Marx explaining what the analysis of capitalism. Marx says this: rate of profit is probably the essential measure to measure the health of any economic unit. Okay, so it is not the amount of profit what matters for the capitalist. It is the rate of profit. Okay, and I am just basically summarizing to you what Marx says in that
No, you're not. I'm sorry.
in the chapter. What do you
Oh,
mean?
no.
So rate of profit in the 1950s and 60s was high enough, much higher than interest rates, and therefore in the West, mainly those developed economies, especially in the United States, because of rate of profit was high, industrial expansion, employment, all was growing. So the growth rate was healthy from a capitalist point of view. But in late 1960s, according to all measures, rate of profit started to decline or to stop, to increase. So during this period, all the capitalists, their advisors, politicians, they were looking for ways how to increase rate of profit again. Because those earlier 2 decades, 1950s and 60s, came to be known as the golden age of capitalism. One of the most well-known Marxist historian, Eric Hobsbawm, used this term, golden age of capitalism, 1950s and 60s. But in the 1970s, that was the search. So in that search, they looked around, okay, how can we make sure that we will cut the costs and increase the profit? So the only thing they can do, they cannot cut the cost of raw materials, you have to buy them. You cannot cut cost of the buildings or machines, they are just fixed. So the only cost that they can play with, the wages you pay to your workers. So that's why at the beginning of neoliberalism, all those assaults, all those attacks against trade union laws, workers' conditions, all those social rights were eliminated one by one. So people were forced to work longer, harder, with less real wages. So from 1970s, beginning of them, up to 1990s, everywhere in the Western world, if you look at the real wages, according to International Labour Organization statistics, the real wages declined, seriously declined. And as a result of this, they increased the rate of profit slightly. And that's why they, for some time, they managed to keep the investment at some level, but not as high as the previous level. And also, what happened in this period, when you increase your rate of profit, which means you are producing, you are selling, but who's going to buy your items? Those same workers, same people who are earning less now, they cannot afford to buy a second television, they cannot afford to buy a car. If, let's say, a rich person, or the owner of Microsoft, buys 1 million pair of shoes a year, it doesn't compensate those 30 million people who couldn't buy a second pair of shoes. So therefore, in this period came a second important term in order to answer rate of profit, financialization. So after rate of profit, one has to understand what financialization means. Do you understand what I'm talking about?
I'm very familiar with all of that.
Okay.
Yes, but you're dodging. I'm sorry. They control the rate of inflation through the IMF, extracting, the super exploitation of the rest of the world by corrupting and destabilizing practically every country in the world. Marx's take on the declining rate of profit was because the working class of the rest of the world would not allow the hegemonies, the once capitalist, the once Christian hegemonies, to continue to rip them off. That was why the rate of tendency was bound to fall sooner or later.
Stop the dialogue.
Okay, and you want.
Considering all your discussions and your discussion as well, also the scenario you predicted or you set up, by the end of this century, we will witness maybe multiple world, a global system. Within that context, even non-existence of a European Union, maybe despite its lacks and faults, it was a sort of isle of, I think, human rights. Will we be able to continue discussing about or talking about human rights by the end of this century?
What's this?
Before that, can we take another one?
Okay, Nick.
I was really interested in both the talks. What Bullen says about the rate of profit post-war, I think, is an important factor in explaining the position we're in now. And Marx doesn't say that the impact of workers' wages does have an impact on the rate of profit, but there's a bunch of other factors as well, and as is well known, it's the rising organic composition of capital that he sees as the main factor against which other factors are countervailing against that. So where am I now? So you see, what you were, I'm very interested in what you're saying, and I think an area that I'm interested in exploring is the interaction between the geopolitical changes that you were discussing, and you referred, and Bullitt referred to Righi and the passing from one hegemon to another. To that extent, he's talking about the eternal return to an original state where you get a hegemonic power asserts itself on the world, starting in his thesis going back to Genoa, I think, and then the Dutch, British, Americans, and then he's looking forward to who might be the next hegemon, and he talks in his last book about China potentially fulfilling that role, and economic and financial crises being part of that process whereby a hegemon is no longer able to control the global economy. I think that's interesting, it's historical. I'm not sure whether you can project it forward in that way. I agree with you that the United States doesn't have the power that it had in the immediate Second World War period, but it struggled to maintain that for a long time. And someone referred to, I think Bullitt referred to 40 years of crisis of American hegemony. If you go back 40 years from now, that's to, I'm trying to work out, that's the 1960s, the end of the 1960s. So the Vietnam War was obviously a crisis for American hegemony. So that's a sort of the period when America was an unchallenged hegemon is relatively short. You're talking about 30, 40 years or so, which is shorter than the British hegemony lasted, if you much shorter time. So you're talking about a different. So you're not talking to that extent about the return of the same. And Righi does say that these hegemonic powers seem to become more and more powerful and dominant. So he's saying there is a change that overlays that in the style in which hegemonic powers rule. But where does that interact with the kind of crisis you're talking about with the rate of profit? Because that's something different from that. Marx wasn't talking in Capital 3 about the impact that different hegemonic powers would have, obviously. He's talking about the changes in the political economy. So I'm interested in the interaction between patterns in the political economy and changes over time in that, and changes in the geopolitics and what the interaction between those is. I don't find Righi's explanation for that satisfactory from a Marxist perspective, because I don't think he's explaining it in Marxist terms. So I wonder whether you've got any comment to make on that.
First was this, then
Okay, what's it?
Yeah, I don't know, I didn't hear your question about human rights.
You know,
So if they have
with the
to-
disappearance of European Union from the picture, one of the big hegemonic powers, are we still, because in the recent past, European Union was kind of the source of the many human rights criteria.
You're saying they're predicting, I mean,
Can you speak louder, please?
yes, I can. I mean, these are discourses that may be around, may not be around. These are discourses.
There is not. Wants to say something.
Hmm?
I'm trying to see.
Yeah, these are discourses that are usually employed by hegemonic powers to serve certain means, certain political means, human rights, humanitarian intervention. United States use human rights at convenience anytime. I mean, why should they disappear as a discourse? I don't think they will. In any
Not as a discourse, but maybe as institutions. Because when you look at the European Union, it is the home of many institutions in relation to human rights. But the emerging powers, China, Russia, or the others, would they be able to, or would they want to set up or establish?
Why not? Why not? I mean, I don't think that they have any particular adversity.
Authoritarian.
No, I mean, they find ways to accommodate the authoritarianism with human rights. I don't have any doubt about that. Whoever is in charge, one of the key elements in neoliberal and ordoliberal theory is the rule of law. The rule of law, see, is a very important component. It's part and parcel of neoliberal, ordoliberal thinking.
As enforced by the military, which is the point that I was trying to make earlier.
As?
Enforced by the military. Militarily enforced.
Not necessarily and at all times. If you have a state of exception, which borders on the Constitution, because Schmidt, which I mentioned, Schmidt says a state of exception is justifiable in order to save the market order. That's the only way you can see getting rid of.
I mean, it was Hegel that first said that, wasn't it? Hegel said,
not exception. The absolute state is not a state of exception. The state of exception is just you basically suspend one article from your constitution. I mean, if you have exception is a constitutional. If you have exception, you have a military dictatorship. You can have Nazis legitimately electorally coming to power because people voted for Hitler and Mussolini, right? They voted. But then they face a situation which will say we have to have a state of exception in order to beat inflation and to stop unemployment. If you read the manifesto of Hitler, I mean, it's amazing. And you close your eyes, you think that this is German social democracy.
the same with Bismarck.
It usurped all the principles of classical social democracy, Hitler. Le Pen usurped all the principles of European social democracy. Le Pen, close your eyes, you hear Le Pen, and I think it's even left-wing social democracy, communist even. You know what Hitler says, one famous thing, it is not capital that makes labor, it's labor that makes capital.
The courts accepted that in the second international.
So let me just tell you, human rights, I said it.
When you finish up, Bülent will answer.
No, you are, you go.
Nick, I'm really glad that you brought the topic, and basically I just explained how we bring Marx, retrospect from Marx, and the hegemonic shift together. And basically this is what I think Peter Gowan started this first. Peter Gowan, before he died, in his last work, and especially in his unpublished articles, which we published after his death, two articles we published, and he basically takes rate of profit as described by Marx in that volume, and then he explains this as the economic policy dimension of declining phase of the US hegemony. So US hegemony starts its decline from late 1960s, and in this phase, the corresponding economy was declining rate of profit, and then they introduced as a response a number of measures. These measures have social and political oppressive dimensions. So the rise of the hegemonic power corresponds to different sets of economic and social and political policies, but this declining phase corresponds exactly to neoliberalism. So in this sense, we use rate of profit to measure this economic process, and then we present this as the corresponding economic set of policies of a declining hegemonic power.
Okay.
Can I mention, because Nick's comment is very useful, it was that period of time when Bretton Woods system collapsed, 71. Here there is a dispute whether it was a deliberate policy by the United States in order to reinforce itself, which Peter Gowan says it was, and others say it was a spontaneous structural development because the US had to divide in order to sort out its balance of payment problems. But here with the rest of the developmental caucuses like Germany, West Germany, and Japan. I'm happy to have a position in the middle, or I don't mind. But what happened is the reality of the falling rate of profit in the manufacturing sector. So when the businessman sees the falling rate of profit going down, what are they going to do? That's the raison d'etre of business people. They have to either to commit suicide or to go and do something else, Paul. Go and do something else. They financialized. Financialization means three major things. It means financialization of financial enterprises, banks. I'll tell you, explain what it means by that. It means financialization of non-financial enterprises, right? Everybody financialized because there is a profiteering. And financialization of everyday life. Each one of us has a mortgage. Who does not? Not you. So you can go on strike. Eh? I cannot because you told me, remind me. Engels in his book, The Question of Housing Question, said, you have a mortgage, he said, you hold him by your... That is wisdom. And I remember, everybody has a mortgage. Who can go on strike? In Britain. You're going to sack him. Who's going to pay the mortgage? We go on the street. So financialization of everyday life is very important. Financialization of non-financial enterprise. They business people who make financial profits or swap currencies in the city of London, they don't invest this in real material production. In manufacturing, in farming, in this and that. No, the guilds, they invest them back to financial paper, to futures, to special vehicles, to CDS in order to make more profit and so on. Speculate. So therefore, the rate of profit moved that, and I haven't done any work, not because I'm not a pure economist, and I should discuss with other people who are economists and they know good mathematics about that. The financial profit, how compensates for the material profit? How can an economy be sustained? Me and Boulez believe that this is a major vulnerability of Anglo-Saxon economies. It will not last. One bubble is built over the other, and bubbles pop. And I had Andrew Gamble at UEL giving a paper last week, and he said, the crisis has been postponed, has not been solved in the Anglo-American world, hasn't been any solid type of economic development. Instead, the financial bubble is being rebuilt again and again, and nobody knows what's going to happen in a few years' time. All economists say, Mike Roberts says that in his blog, who's an orthodox Marxist economist, etc. So this is financialization, replacing the Keynesian consensus, the Keynesian solid development built on boosting aggregate demand management, solid industry, growth, global, golden age of capitalism, steady growth, no inflation, high wages, Fordist model. This is all gone.
Okay. Would you like to say?
Yeah, I wanted to respond to the question about the future. And I agree with you. don't predict the future somebody who thinks about history, and I wouldn't do that. But what is the core question for me? I mean, everybody has contributed in various ways to the facts which we are observing, but everybody has a different reasoning, different approach. We have heard a variety of approaches, and we don't refer to the approach and we don't explain our approach. And I think that is the first thing we ought to ask ourselves: what is the fundamental dynamic of the present development? What is driving change? What is the main factor? And I agree with you. Well, it's a bit simplistic, but from my point of view, it is the rise of labor against capital, against ownership. The financialization is the separation of ownership from direct intervention in the economic process, which has to do with the investment. It's not the capitalists or those who dominate ownership in the global society who make decisions on investment. It is within the labor process, and the labor process is extremely divided. Take the example of the what's it called, chief manager in a company, maybe an owner of another company or of any assets, but the management is something which is inherently a labor process nowadays. It's part of a labor process, but the labor process is enormously divided. And to simplify it from that point of view, if that is the dynamic, that ownership becomes divided from the real economy, then the future is in the hands of labor. And it depends on how labor is organized. And I find it difficult to agree with you that the future is the class solidarity, global class solidarity. I've just reviewed a book which goes into details of class solidarity in the shipbuilding industry between 1950 and 1980. And class solidarity is based on the company and local solidarity, and has enormous problems to organize global movements. From my point of view, we ought to discuss in the first place what we regard as a dominant dynamic, and I claim it is the development of the labor process, the social relations in the labor process, which we should look at in the first place, because then we can talk about how it will look in the future. But it's not about the future, it's about understanding the dynamic of the present in the first place.
Okay. Before you start.
Yeah, found your presentations very interesting. I think they raise some very important issues. Most important of which I think is that you actually identify that the world is actually entering an extremely dangerous situation, because I think even this week, the whole business in Turkey and Saudi Arabia, all of that is really about Erdogan negotiating, playing for position in a situation where I think everybody can see the storm clouds growing over the Middle East. It's really about fighting for position of advantage. Because Trump really, in this week as well, has basically said, right, we're finished with any controls over nuclear weapons. He's basically preparing for another arms race, and we know where that always ends. I think you're absolutely right about the breakdown of the world order that has reigned over the world since 1945 under American hegemony. And we're now entering a period where that hegemony is breaking down. And you don't have to look very far for a parallel period, 1914 to 1945, was again a period in which one hegemony broke down, basically British imperialism, and it was replaced eventually by US imperialism. But in between, there's a massive struggle about who actually reigns the world. And I think the other thing is that you touched on other issues about the development of capitalism, rate of profit and so forth. I think there's enough evidence now that was probably lacking 100 years ago that we can actually see genuine patterns in the way that modes of production develop. Modes of production develop in stages. I think it's quite clear that capitalism has already developed in 2 stages. I mean, there was the 19th century stage that broke down between 1940 and 45, and there's a second stage that emerged after 45. We're now approaching the end of that stage. What takes over after that is, again, you can't predict the future, and that's where I begin to disagree maybe with some of your predictions about a world being more dominated by China and India. Because I think the future is determined by class struggle. And it's so important. I mean, what Marxism does, and really I don't like the term Marxism, because it's like calling science Newtonianism or Einsteinism. Because if it's a genuine science, it always, the greatest mind is always superseded by somebody else, some other theory and so forth. And too much what goes by Marxism today is really about trying to quote Marx and prove the world exists according to what Marx said 100 years ago. Marx made a really important beginning to develop a scientific analysis of capitalism as a mode of production. And it's important that, I mean, what really will determine the future is the class struggle. And you know, according to Marxism, the working class struggle is the most important movement in the world. And you touched on that right at the end, that really what will determine that is the development of a new revolutionary movement. And for that, you can't dictate how the working class movement will develop. Because at the moment, I think, in Britain, we're actually ahead of the game, quite frankly. I mean, what is happening in the Labour Party is absolutely unique in my view. It doesn't have all the answers. Corbyn is not JC, Jesus Christ, and MacDonald. Yeah, they've all got their limitations, but what is going on in Britain at the moment is the fact that the Labour Party, for the first time in a long time, is actually beginning to wage a struggle, a class struggle, and there are people joining that, and Marxists now see the Labour Party as an area where they can actually make a contribution. The problem with Marxism over the last 100 years is that it actually ceased to develop in the way Marx and Engels started it off. I had a discussion with Ishmael, some time ago about this last week. And I think even under Lenin, I think serious problems emerged, because that whole period of 1914 to 45, Marxism as developed by Lenin and Trotsky and all the rest was seriously defective, quite frankly. I mean, all their ideas about the idea of developing socialism in backward countries, which were at the revolutionary edge of developing the world order, and the idea of actually the Soviet Union being socialist, has all been proven to be bollocks, quite frankly. Marxism is not a guide to what actually happened over the last 100 years. And I think we really have to seriously start developing Marxism again in a scientific way to actually understand what is going to happen. These stages of any modes of production, some of them are basically characterised by expansion and development, and later stages will be characterised by death and decline. And Lenin got it totally wrong, saying that capitalism is already moribund and dead. And Trotsky talked about the death agonies of capitalism. Within a few years, capitalism was imbued with a new growth and development. How can you talk about capitalism being dead and defunct when it's developed robots and computerisation and all the rest of it? So to actually work out what this new stage of struggle is going to mean is capitalism still capable of growing and developing and being another hegemon, say China, taking over the further development of capitalism? Or is capitalism now gone over the hill, and is it now going in that period of genuine transition. You know, in the past they talk about transition. I don't believe that. Capitalism wasn't in a period of capitalism and socialism transition because events have shown that that was wrong. There is a possibility that that may now be the case now. I mean, in other words, really what we should be looking at, focusing on, is whether the working class movement can this time develop the means to develop a global movement that can actually challenge capitalism and start to take state power. Which, what happened in the 20s and 30s, the Communist International, quite frankly, I think was a catastrophe. It was an absolute catastrophe. The effect it had on the working class movement, and it actually took a great responsibility for the rise of fascism and the role that it took in dividing the working class movement. And I think we've got to be really careful what we do now. You know, because I think all the people, all the trends that go under the name Marxism, Trotskyites, Maoists, all the rest of it, they have to rethink. You know, I think people need to start just not identifying with what happened in the past, but actually start thinking and think, how can we actually develop the class struggle now? Because the class struggle is always conditioned by the economics of the day. And we have to understand what is the economic stage of development of capitalism today. Is it still on the up? In which case, yes, China may be able to do what USA did, you know, and create a new period of hegemony. Or is it actually genuinely in real crisis where you're talking about a working class period of working class power can emerge? There's a possibility of that. And you hinted that right at the end, and that is the thing I'd like to we should be developing. You know, sorry about that.
Yes, I agree with most of what you said about the Communist International, the past, not to take Marxism as a kind of a series of criteria which we try to justify what we are doing now. I completely agree. I also share your optimism about Labour Party as a matter. This is the only legal party I ever decided to join, just because of Jeremy Corbyn. But in general, I mean, again, I'm glad that you noticed the last bit of my presentation, which I think important for future as well. When we are talking about the labor, I mean, you mentioned again a very important point. The labor force are organized differently and divided, and so many divisions. But we are limiting ourselves with what we are surrounded by. I mean, we are not looking at the globe as a whole. For the first time in human history, the world is disunited. Any technology, any knowledge happening in one part of the world, within a few minutes goes to other parts.
The production process is united.
Production, yeah, exactly. I mean, everywhere, the workers, the owners, the research and development departments, they are using the same technology in the most backward part of India, to the Latin America, to United States, to Seattle, to London. But if you look at the number of people joining in the workforce, the global labor force, the last 20-25 years witness the amazing number of new people joined. I mean, we are talking about, oh, the old working class are disappearing. Maybe disappearing here. But if you look at the actual numbers, I mean, how many people? I think more than 1 billion people joined the last 20 to 25 years in the global capitalist workforce. This is amazing. Never in the past history the world seen anything like that. So what is happening in China, in those thousands of factories, India, in many parts of Africa, in Latin America, people, thousands of people are working as almost like 19th century workers with their hands, with the tools, with the machines, but using the latest technology. So these people are not like blue-collar workers. They are actual hardcore workers. And the numbers are increasing. I mean, in China, the main task, the Chinese Communist Party this year's Congress and in the previous 3 Congresses, they always repeat this. Their main task is how to make sure that the urban the rural population join in the workforce and increase their living standards up to the levels of the urban workforce. And they managed this. Even IMF, in one of their recent reports, they said that never in history this big number of human beings, their living standards increased this much. You know, when 2008 crisis hit the Western world, one of the first things the Chinese Communist Party did, they introduced new measures in order to secure their economy, and because they were going to sell less after that, also in order to keep their labor force stable, they introduced new measures, especially in the rural areas. That they said, if you are going to buy a second washing machine, a second television, a second thing, we are going to give you completely interest-free credit. And they opened new factories. And as a result of this, within 3-4 years' time, their actual incomes increased 3 times. This never happened in any other parts of the world. In Brazil, something similar happened under Lula. And probably in Africa now, in various parts where the capitalism going mainly with the Chinese investment, the people are experiencing the same. So still there is a huge number of people in the world, they are joining the workforce every single day. But if we look at just around ourselves, of course we are seeing that factories are being closed, and every day, I mean, the place where I live in Stockholm-Trent, every weekend when I go to city center, I see more and more shops are closed, more and more people are unemployed. But of course, in the global scale, we are representing a small part of the global population. And therefore, I am optimistic in the sense that the conditions are emerging more and more a global labor force solidarity. Because the communication and using the same technology and being influenced by the others are much tighter, much closer linked to today. I mean, just imagine if the Chinese working class organized and went out to strike, and this will affect everybody else in the world. And then the conditions will be more convenient for the African labor, European labor, Latin American labor, join them. But in the past, we've never been in this situation.
It's fine.
Well, I have had some sort of discussion with you before about this. What I'm going to say is this. There are conflicting or contradicting developments in different spheres. One of them is the contradiction between the state and the capital. The state precedes capitalism. Capitalism has used the state which it found before for its own purposes. But on the other hand, I think the main unit of capitalism is actually called corporation. Now, what capitalism is doing is it is transforming the state now into a corporation. You see everywhere the trends of this. They started in the municipal levels. If you go to Haringey, you find almost all functions are being privatized. It is the same elsewhere as well, and in different levels, of course.
You mean everywhere in England?
Everywhere in England, everywhere in Europe, even in Norway, the social democratic places, the functions of the old state are being privatized.
But not in the majority of the world. This is
well,
my point.
State is becoming is part of the capitalist system.
State in the West.
Well,
let's use the terms properly.
Well,
because we are not representing even half of the world.
Okay, well, the anomaly we had before, I think, there was a country called Soviet Union which pretended to be socialist. So the whole world had seemed as if it was divided into two worlds. But what we understand now is that there is only one system, capitalism, all over. Even the Chinese Communist Party is representing the management of capitalism under communist rule or Communist Party's management. Now, what happens is that at the very end, all different capitalists try to take the leadership, but there is one problem here. Americans represent the most pure capitalist philosophy. They say that, yes, the surplus value is created by the individual capitalists, so they should have all of it, so they don't need the state to interfere at all. Now, as long as somebody else, it could be Chinese as well, can defend the purer capitalist way than the Americans, I think American leadership will continue somehow. Our problem is, of course, different. We have a labor problem. Labor must stand globally against capital everywhere. They have that situation has its own problems, but that is another discussion. Thank you.
Okay. We've got only 15 minutes. Every speaker 3 minutes, please. Imran, yeah.
Well, actually, when we discuss, rosy situation comes out that there is development and loss of wealth and etc. But we always need to look at the majority and minority. Working class is the majority, and the multinational corporations are the minority really. And yes, perhaps they are making lots of development, lots of this and that, but when we look at actually what is to the actual people, the division between them and also the poorer and the richer nations are extremely divided. And I don't believe that the gap is coming smaller and smaller. Yes, some of the countries like China, India, etc., they made a great development, but at the same time, that was on the base of exploiting the working class more and more. And the exploitation is not on the wage level. Wage level is reflected on the health, reflected on the access to the new technology, etc. Is extremely hard to see what will happen in the end, because education level, especially health level, people will be very different. That's what I see, especially on the health level. When I look at it, there is no proper food because of the food industries, and there is no proper medicine because of the pharmaceutical companies making greater profits, and we are more and more deprived of the proper food, proper medication. So in those things, and human rights that my colleague has mentioned there, they are all because the state has become the actual force of introducing and maintaining this multinational companies' profit-making needs, is becoming more and more authoritarian. And under this authoritarianism, we can't discuss about the human rights, we can't discuss about the national health, we can't discuss about any welfare state up till now, whatever is developed. So those are extremely difficult things. I mean, just one point which really always crosses my mind. When I go to the shopping, I look around very and I said, there's no proper food here. Whatever we eat is all carton, really, believe me. And it is the health response on our body, it makes extremely bad things, and everybody is ill, cancer, joint problem, this problem and that problem, and it comes from the food.
We are made of microplastics.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to just you said it again. The main investment nowadays is, we should keep in mind, is education. All the innovation we have seen in the recent generation is basically as a result of a new level of education. And this education is not through investment by capital, it's through investment through the state. we are not living in the same era of capitalism anymore. I call it post-capitalism, I must say. But it's not based anymore, this innovation and change. We could also call it growth. You mentioned growth, especially in China and India and so on. It's all based on, not on surplus value, but on investment in education. So we are really living in a different world, and we must address that. And if we don't, all these phenomena need to be related to what is the basic development, or on what the present development is basically founded.
Okay, last question, and then I'm going to 5 minutes each to finish that, because we've got to finish at +8.
Okay.
Yes.
Just the labour process, I think, I would say, has been that Joanna's tried to bring out, and also the approach that Robin over there, thank you, brought out. The new opportunities presented by the Corbyn, whatever's going on around Corbyn. The point that I was trying to make, and I obviously made it very badly, and I must apologise really. Humankind's interactions with the rest of the rest of nature are planned. They've always been planned. That's what we do differently. I mean, you know, the whole nature of agriculture. So the human labour process is the production of its own food. We plant things, and we interfere with the evolution of other species like no other species does. And the whole notion of enlightened planning, which has nothing to do with financial planning, it's just, is there enough food for all of humankind to survive? Are we doing it in a sustainable fashion so that we don't need wars and we don't need class conflict? So we're trying to replace all the mutually antagonistic hegemonies, which are anyway, I would say were militarily enforced, with a classless society. Now we're on if we don't achieve that in the next generation, we're not going to, the opportunity won't be there. No. We'll have destroyed the conditions of our existence.
It doesn't exist anymore anyway.
And they barely exist. We're living on borrowed time. And the bit that, I do worry a little bit that, you know, the introduction that you made to this didn't start from that that conception, that contradiction, the fact that we are living on borrowed time.
Class division in the Marxist sense doesn't exist anymore. Full stop.
But remember that we are presenting our book, not what you want to hear. I mean, we had a kind of a book structure in our mind, and actually I tried to remember what I wrote because I didn't have time to sit down and to read the kind of. Sorry to say that, but you know, we are addressing our main
the issues they want to address rather than
I know.
what you want to address.
It happens all the time. It happens all the time. Can we just go and go 2-3 minutes?
I want to just start.
Just as I say, the labour process first. The labour process is a very important starting point, and especially for a Marxist analysis to start the class analysis beginning with the labour process. Gramsci did it in Fordism and Americanism, and it's a very illuminating text. We're not in that period now. I agree. A labour process should be seen through what Peter Deakin calls, for example, global production networks. You have a mobile phone. One part of it is produced in China, the other part in Hawaii, the other part in Z. They are assembled in London. Yeah? Now, the problems we have as Marxists in that sense is, although we see that value production is the unifying factor of this ontology, of the process, how you get all these people together? History has invented only one entity, a nation state.
Yes.
Right? Whether we are, and now at the nation state level, whether you like it or not, I know you're a globalist, I'm a globalist, so at nation state level, we have to go by what Lenin said. No. If we want to unite the people, we need to divide them first. That's what Lenin said. It's very political rhetoric.
So you're
but-
Leninist here.
yeah, but it's very political, but so the nation state is still the
Essence?
something to get hold of, to try to do something from a working class perspective, because the labor process, although there is this value, global value and so on, you unite for, you cannot unite this. It's very fragmented even at the nation state level. You have part-time workers, you have even zero-time contract. What is all that? How can you unite it? In the past, when we were a Gastarbeiter, you had thousands of people there in your trade unions. Now, after Thatcher, wiped out.
But those thousands of people together still there.
Still, yeah.
In the new ones are like that. This is my point.
Yeah.
I mean, we are limiting ourselves with just this part of the world.
Yeah. Food and health, I have no comment. I agree entirely. We eat junk. And yeah, cancer is an industrial disease. This is what it is. I mean, I have no comment on that. One only comment on the class triangle. Let's stop. The class triangle. We tend to see as Marxists, what is the history? Is the history of class struggle. But we tend to see it only in a vertical way, which is the opposition between the worker and the bourgeois. There is also another type of class triangle taking place, which is primarily responsible for the crisis of 2007-2008, and is the class triangle inside the bourgeoisie. No one can blame the working class that Northern Rock collapsed because of a movement like 1968 in Paris and a working class strike, whatever strikes. It's internal contradiction, factional contradiction of various types of capital, financial type of inside the dominant form of financialized capitalism. This is collapsed. So even the bourgeoisie cannot rule itself even without opposition from the workers. I don't think they are better off than us in that respect. You know, hundreds of them committed suicide in New York and London after the financial crisis. Hundreds of them. You know.
I mean, I'll just start what you said, saying that how do we bring all these people, you mean, I think the laborers together?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, we don't need to bring anyone together. The conditions will bring them together. This is my optimistic expectation. All this process we mentioned about the global hegemonic powers, what's happening over there, all these conditions moving in that direction, also creating a huge labor force. I mean, we are talking about, because our experience is this part of the world. We are talking about how much the labor process changed here, how much of the working class disappeared. But of course, this is, if you look at the percentages, it's not even unlike all the Western world and United States. Not even 30–40% of the global labor force. If you look at the actual numbers, I mean, I'm talking about China, India today, and many parts of Africa, Latin America. Every day, new factories are being opened, and these are really gigantic complexes. Thousands of people work there and then live it. And some of the towns in China, some of the towns that are much bigger than some European countries. A whole town was constructed during the last 15 years around a number of factories. So people from the rural areas brought there and they became factory workers in the traditional sense of the term. They are not blue-collar workers, and then they are living in that town. Their children going to those schools, and because those factories, they are producing maybe one little piece of the mobile telephone, but thousands of them doing this day after day. So for them, for those workers, there is no difference. It doesn't matter whether they are producing a whole telephone. It doesn't matter what they produce goes to another country. I mean, it matters in the sense that that process, the division of process, labor process, connecting them to other laborers in the other parts of the world. But in the 19th century, they had no idea about what was, let's say, British workers in Manchester or Rochdale or Stoke-on-Trent, they had no idea what other workers were doing. But now they are connected at least by the labor process. So this is what I am saying. I mean, the world is moving in that direction. It is not moving backward. I mean, many people here in this country, I'm not talking about this group, but many academics started writing the last 20 years post-capitalism, and then all about post-capitalism, how can we adjust ourselves post-capitalism? Well, maybe post-capitalism in this small unit, but globally it is capitalism. It is capitalism in the traditional definition of the term. And you mentioned about education, it's a very good example. I think both of you mentioned about education. You know how many universities in China exist? More than 2,000. How many universities in this country exist? Less than 200. And those 2,000 universities, every single one of them is bigger, much bigger than even the biggest universities here. And also, go to every single university in this country, in America, in many European countries. What is the biggest group of students coming from other countries? Chinese. In my university, which is in the middle of nowhere, in Stoke-on-Trent, we have 10,000 students. At least 1,000 of them are from China. So those 2,000 universities are not enough to educate their young people. They are also sending their young people abroad to learn, to get the latest technology, the latest development, the latest debate and discussions about sciences and social sciences. So that's why, if you put all these number of brains together, of course their creativity will be much bigger than the creativity of the rest of the world. So this is the direction. At the top level, this will affect the growth of economy and the hegemonic position, but at the level of the workers, this is also creating the conditions which is more convenient, much more possible than ever in the world history for global working class solidarity.
Thank you very much for both of you. I think what was the name of the book?
The title of the book is not Global Power Shift. Is the subtitle is the
Disintegration of Euro-Atlanticism and New Authoritarianism.
Disintegration of Euro-Atlanticism.
Last things I would like to say, this is, in my opinion, the governments, capitalists, trying to, making their plans in the last 70 years, to make world a kind of strong leaders world, and they trying to make the people apolitic. The politicians understand it, but because of economic, they cannot choose the economic problems. They are creating their own enemy, killers. This photograph easily shows there are many people from different communities. They came together against Bailout. So, and as Bülent said, and we can learn, we can hear from each other because of the new technological revolution. All the opportunities, all the danger create new opportunities. Are we going to use these opportunities or not? This is the question.
How do we?
Okay. Thank you very much.